The outline of my presentation, real quick. The first part, I want to explore and explain some of the obvious problems that arise from the globalized production and distribution of food. Um, there are a lot of issues with the type of farming that's coming to dominate the world and how people access food for their daily lives. Secondly, I want to try and debunk or uh, disprove some common myths and lies that are associated with small scale production. There's a lot of ideas out there that people who live on small subsistence farms are backwards, are poverty stricken, and are simply not able to respond to the challenges of the day. And I want to try and look at some of those myths a little bit more carefully. And lastly, I want to explain how three different systems, agroecology, permaculture, and other small scale farming systems can respond to the problems we're going to look at. So let's start with the first one. What are some of the problems with the globalized agro industry that provides an enormous amount of food for people around the world? Well, first of all, it requires an enormous amount of chemical inputs. If you look at this picture, a lot of the farmers around where I live, when they go out in their fields, they look like they're actually going into a laboratory. They have these full hazmat suits on because they're spraying extremely, extremely dangerous chemicals. A lot of times, especially in Europe, there's a little bit better legislation controlling what types of chemical inputs, what type of pesticides can and cannot be used. But in most parts of the third world, such as El Salvador, there's very, very limited, if any, regulation on these types. So the most dangerous pesticides and herbicides and other inputs that are banned in the United States and in Europe and other parts are those that the companies then send those to places like El Salvador or countries in Africa or Asia or South America. If we look at that, the UN FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, did a study in 2020 that said that the total use of pesticides in agriculture was 2.7 million tons of ingredients that are used each and every year. We look at that, there are all sorts of different problems associated with that. Pesticides obviously destroy the life that's in the soil, all of the worms and nematodes and other different types of animals. They've created a pretty firm link between the massive use of pesticides and the sudden disappearance of an enormous amounts of honeybees. As most people know, honeybees are extremely important for pollinizing an enormous amount of the food crops that we exist. And all of a sudden, because of this use of pesticides, a lot of these bee colonies are simply disappearing. And without bees, there's no corn, there's no cabbage, there's no fruit trees, because all of those different crops depend on bees for the pollination. Another huge issue is herbicides. Herbicides are another type of chemical agricultural input that's used to control weeds and grasses and other unwanted, plants. A recent study from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC in the United States, found that 80% of people in the United States have glyphosate, which is the most commonly used herbicide, in their urine. I didn't write this one down, but another recent study found something like that worldwide. 3 out of 4 breastfeeding women had traces of glyphosate in their breast milk that they were obviously passing on to their babies. The health consequences of this situation are still unknown, although many scientists are starting to make the links that glyphosate, that herbicides, are linked with all sorts of different types of cancers and other health problems. Actually, Monsanto, which is one of the biggest companies marketing a famous herbicide called Roundup Ready, had to pay, I forget, several $1 million to a small farmer who sued them because he was dying from cancer. And so this massive use of herbicides, which is in pretty much all of our bodies, and now we're starting to discover that this is a cancer-causing chemical. Another issue with this massive agro industry that we've come to depend on is the loss of topsoil. The entirety of the earth, of the land surface of Earth, is covered. The majority of the land surface is rock and subsoil, things that you can't grow things on because it's hard, it's lacking in nutrients. And then there's this very thin layer across the entire coat of the earth, which in some areas is only a couple inches thick, and in some fortunate areas it might be a meter thick. But everywhere there's this very thin coat of topsoil, which is where we grow the food that we need. Without that topsoil, there is no food. If you look at this picture here, this is a common picture that's very common, unfortunately, on large farms around the world, where when you grow things, with massive tractors, with massive inputs of herbicides and pesticides, when you kill the soil, it eventually washes away, and what you get is that small, very thin layer of soil upon which all of us depend, essentially, washes away, washes into the sea. It's estimated that 24 billion tons of fertile soil are lost each year due to erosion, and the vast majority of that is on agricultural soils due to agro-industrial farming methods. But to put that into perspective, that's 3.4 tons of topsoil lost for every year for every person on the planet. And then perhaps the most, I would say that, there's no shortage of uh, kind of like fear mongering statistics that you can read on the internet. But the one that most kind of, I would say, gives me fear and makes me feel vulnerable was that a top UN official recently said that the world's topsoil could disappear completely in 60 years. That essentially means that we have 60 years of harvests left. I'm 40 years old, so if I live to be 100, that means when I turn 100, that will be the last the last year of our farming experiment as humanity. That's a serious issue. It's something that I think we have to come up that we have to talk about. Another serious issue, another threat that comes with the globalization of the food supply and agro industry in general is that there is an increasingly large and strong corporate monopoly on seeds for agriculture and all other sorts of different inputs. So, for example, there are just 4 seed companies that control 60% of the global market of seeds. In the picture here, you see there's the Bayer and Monsanto are 2 of the largest and most well-known agro companies, agro industry companies around the world. And I think it was maybe 10 years ago they merged to actually make one company. And so when you have very, very limited diversification of seeds, that's a problem. So it used to be, for example, here in El Salvador, every community had their own native types of corn. We live up on the mountain, and so the small farmers had, their own type of corn that they would grow and would save the seeds year by year. The people who lived down in the valleys where things were warmer, they had their own type of seed. And all of these seeds have been developed over generations and generations to respond to the different climatic factors, to the different types of soil types, etc. And all of that's had developed by very wise indigenous traditions over so many years, right? And then now what we have is we have just very, very few companies that control that, and that poses risks not only to diversity, but also the fact that we rely essentially on 4 companies to provide us with the seeds we need for the food we eat. Um, one other quick challenge that I think is that merits talking about is that there's simply a lack of farmers around the world. The average age of people who grow our food is 60 years old. If we said that same statistic about, let's say, doctors or dentists, I think people would be kind of fearful of that. That why aren't young people wanting to practice medicine or practice dentistry? We need new suppliers of people who will cure us when we get sick. The same can be said for farmers. If you have people who are approaching retirement age, and that's the average age of farmers, that means that most young people do not want to get into that. In the United States, farm and ranch families comprise less than 2% of the total US population, and that number is continuing to go down. And the same thing is happening around the world. Young people, especially, do not want to work on the farms. What does that herald for our future? When we don't, is it safe? Is it healthy to have a population where less than 1% of the people are responsible for growing the food that we eat? Everybody needs to eat. And we need to make sure that we have enough people who are doing that responsibly in a way that we're not causing all of these problems that we mentioned above. So what are the answers to these problems? What do we do? Unfortunately, I would say that there are kind of 3 dominant responses that people are looking at. The first one is, well, let's just turn to food grown in laboratories, lab grown food. Maybe some of you have heard there's a lot of talk about lab grown meat, about how they take these cells from animals and they can reproduce them in these giant vats within a laboratory setting. And they're also doing that not only with meats, but with virtually any type of food. The technology is still very young, but there is an enormous billions and billions of dollars of investment, where the hope is that someday we don't have to grow food on the farms, that we don't need the soil. Who cares if the topsoil washes into the sea? It'll be okay because we have scientists, we have lab technicians, and they're going to be the ones who take control of growing our food in laboratories. I would say that that is a uh, pretty big kind of risk, just to assume that we're going to be able to control that what we've been doing for the entirety of our history as human beings. We're just going to toss that away, throw away all of this accumulated wisdom about how we grow food for ourselves and our families, and rely on a unproven technology. But that's certainly one of the biggest, I would say, kind of proposals on the table, that I think a lot of these big agrochemical corporations, a lot of people in uh, decision making places of power, are realizing that, look, agro industry has caused some serious problems and we need to change. But instead of talking about going back to the land, about redistributing the land for small farmers to grow food in a different way, no, what we're going to do is we're going to turn to the laboratory. Other proposals on the table include more genetic manipulation of the food. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. But the idea is that continue to do that. For example, there's a lot of research right now about how to genetically modify crops to increase yields, to be more resilient to some of the climatic shocks that are going to be happening in the coming years. But yeah, just again, place more of our faith and more of our hope that technologies will get us through this next problem. And then the other thing is, both of these, whether it be lab grown food or genetic manipulation, all of that, requires more and more concentration of power in the world of globalized agriculture and food. So again, less and less companies that are larger and larger, controlling more and more share of seeds, of inputs, and of farming in general. Those are the proposals on the table. The other option that I think we might discuss or talk about is, what about going back, returning to the farms, promoting small scale farming as a way to meet local food needs, healthy food grown locally without so much agricultural inputs, in a way that sustains the local soil, that promotes biodiversity, that protects the earth, that actually farming, when done right, can capture carbon, excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and store it in the soil, store it in plants, store it in trees. What about doing that? I'm not trying to say that I have all the answers, but this is a picture of my small farm, or where me and my family live and work. I did not grow up on a farm, and I wasn't lucky enough to inherit the wisdom of my grandparents who farmed in that case. But it's something that I wanted to do. And my family and I, my wife and our children, have learned, and we've failed at a lot of things. We've done a lot of things wrong, but we've also learned that, in 8 years of hard work, we produce enough food for our family, and then we also have a small CSA, or community supported agricultural program, where every 2 weeks we take food into the city, where we sell to 15 or 16 different families. And so, on a very, very small plot of land, we were able to produce food not only for ourselves, but for a significant portion of the food that 15 or 16 other families can eat. And again, this is a farm that's about 2.5 acres large. And so, what I think is that this opportunity to return to the land is not necessarily like return to poverty and hardship, but an opportunity to return to abundance. I want to bring your attention to, in 2014, there was a UN study on peasant and small scale agriculture that was published, and not a lot of people read it, because it's not a hot topic. But it was loaded with interesting statistics, and I just want to read a few of those. They said that around the world, there are more than 500 million family farms, small farms, not talking about these massive 10,000 acre monoculture farms, but small family farms like this one. They constitute more than 98% of agricultural holdings around the world. The vast majority of farmers around the world are small family farmers. Those farmers are responsible for at least 56% of agricultural production on and exactly 56% of the land. So again, small scale farming is creating an enormous amount of food for people around the world. The USDA, this next statistic is from the United States Department of Agriculture. In the United States, we have this idea that large scale farming is what dominates. But actually, USDA, this is from the US government, their research found that family farms remain a key part of US agriculture, accounting for 98% of all farms and providing 88% of production. Obviously, because the United States has so much land, a small scale family farm is not necessarily as small as a couple acres. It might be 40 acres, 100 acres, but it's still relatively small. Most of farms are small family farms and operate nearly half of U.S. farmland while generating 21% of production. So let's take a look at some of the myths about small scale farming. The first myth that a lot of people think is that we need the big farms. We need agro industry. Otherwise, there's going to be massive hunger, massive famines around the world. People are going to die of hunger if we don't have these huge farms. Well, again, let's turn back to some statistics from the United Nations. The world's smallholder farmers produce around a third of the world's food, according to detailed research from the FAO. 5 out of 6 farms in the world have less than 2 hectares, operate on about 12% of all agricultural land, and produce 35% of the world's food. That's interesting. The smallest farmers, those who have less than 2 hectares, they have less than 12% of the land, but produce 35% of the food. So that means that essentially, they're producing 3 times the amount of food than the land that they have. And so the smallest farmers are actually those who are most productive. Myth number 2 about small scale farming: agro-industry is what feeds the world. This is kind of similar, but it's the idea that large scale farming is what produces the most food. According to another recent report by the FAO, family farms produce more than 3/4 of the world's food. All of these statistics depend on how you measure what entails small scale farmings. But the FAO also estimates that almost 3/4 of all farms in the world are smaller than 1 hectare, or about 2.5 acres. Another myth is that large farms, corporate farmings, are more efficient. So let's go back to this picture here. This is 1 hectare of land, more or less right here. A lot of times when large farmers pay scientists to look at their statistics on how productive will say, well, look, if you were to plant 1 crop on this land, if you were to plant just corn, let's say, then small scale farmers are always going to be less efficient than let's say a 10,000 acre farm that grows corn. Because one, we live in the mountains, there's soil, there's hills, it goes up and down. If we don't have tractors, there's no mechanized farming, we use less inputs, less herbicides, less chemical fertilizers. And so, yeah, if we were to grow 1 crop, then obviously a large scale farm is going to most generally going to be able to provide higher yields for that crop than small scale farming. But what they don't take into consideration a lot of times is that on this small scale farm, in this area here during the rainy season, we grow our corn and beans, like most people here in Central America. Here's where we have our diversified vegetable production. Here's where we keep our animals. We have our sheep and our chickens. Over here, we have a peach orchard. Up in this area, my wife grows different medicinal plants that she sells to local families. Over in this area, we have a small nut orchard, and down by the at the very bottom of our farm, there's a small river where we grow different types of taro root. All of this diversified production, a lot of time, is lost, especially when we're trying to measure production, because small scale subsistence farmers generally use every portion of their land to grow something. And so we look at yields. If we're going to be serious about how efficient production is, you have to take into consideration all of the different uses for the land. You can't see on here, but also in this area, we grow a type of alder tree, which provides for the vast majority of the fuel that we need for cooking our home, for heating our water, etc. All of these things come from the land, and this needs to be taken into consideration when we look at this idea about what is more efficient. So then, go back to more statistics. 1989, National Research Council of the United States concluded that well-managed alternative farming systems almost always use less pesticides, less fertilizers, and less antibiotics for farm animals. Larger farms do not necessarily produce more food, according to the 1992 agricultural census. Small diversified farms produce more than twice as much food per hectare as large farms. And lastly, and this is the myth that I was talking about when we were looking at some of strategies that are out there for how we can respond to the problems. Uh, one of the myths is that all we have to do is continue to rely on technological innovation to solve the problems that industrial agriculture creates. The vast majority of people out there have now recognized and will admit that there are serious problems with topsoil loss, the accumulation of dangerous pesticides and other agrochemical inputs. Farming is one of the largest emitters of carbon dioxide nowadays, when it could be a carbon negative activity, because good farming that's done in a way that respects natural ecosystems can capture carbon. But unfortunately, the farming that the majority of large farmers do today is releasing carbon dioxide from the soil, from animal manures, etc. Um, Also, I think it's worth noting and saying that today's agriculture, large scale agriculture, absolutely relies on abundant cheap oil. Also, obviously, to run the tractors and the combines and things like that, but also for fuel and for fertilizer. All the fertilizers that we use in the world rely on a massive amount of fossil fuels. Cheap oil will not last forever, and when that happens, I guess we need to ask whether we can continue to rely and hope that technological innovation is going to solve the problems. This kind of blind belief, I think, is something that needs to be criticized for sure. Um, so if we're not going to continue, I guess you all probably have understood that I don't think that it is wise for humanity to continue to simply place their trust that Monsanto and Bayer and the other big companies out there are going to simply, always find a way. Maybe they'll come up with some other GMO that increases production. Maybe we'll be lucky enough to shift all of food production into laboratories and not have to worry about farming anymore. I don't think that's a wise idea. I think that wisdom starts with looking at what's worked in the past, and bring into the future. Not whatever we bring into the future has to rely on all of this accumulated knowledge and experience that our ancestors have had. And so I want to talk a little bit about, especially about native and peasant agricultural traditions, but then also about maybe two newer words or new ideas about different farming traditions. One is permaculture and agroecology. So let's start with native agricultural traditions. This picture here, about 6 or 7 years ago, I had the opportunity to do a study in Southeast Asia. And this is a picture of a small village where you can see the terraced hillsides there. They grow rice. Where I live, we don't eat rice. We eat corn and beans. We're from Central America, where the Mayans were. But it was fascinating to learn that this village had actually been in this valley for at least 1,600 years. That's kind of what the archaeological report said, that the community that came here, the indigenous group, moved here about 16 centuries ago. And they had been farming these same hillsides for 1,600 years. And if you put your hand into the soil, where they grow their rice, it's this deep, rich, black topsoil, dozens and dozens of hundreds and thousands of earthworms, and the soil is alive, it is fertile, it is healthy. And that's after 1,600 years of harvests, right? Now, if you take that experience and compare that to what large scale farming is done, large scale farming started maybe 60, 70 years ago. And according to the UN, we only have another 60 years to go before we've gotten rid of all the topsoil, not just in one area, but in the entire earth. So obviously there's a difference between large scale farming, which wastes one of the most precious resources that we have, and indigenous traditions, which have developed ways to survive in specific areas, ensure that they receive an abundant yield of food to support the communities, but without destroying the ecological equilibrium, without destroying the resilience of the environment upon which they depend. So indigenous peoples around the world, not just in Asia, but everywhere, have developed generally sustainable and time-tested production systems. The majority of indigenous people live in a territory. They've lived there for thousands of years, and they've found ways to survive in that landscape without degrading it. Our learning on the subject of sustainability should begin with listening to people who have managed to live for generations in a territory without destroying it. The word sustainability is perhaps one of the most oddly used. Everybody uses the word, and I think nobody understands really what it means. I would say sustainability, if we're going to put a good definition to it, means learning from people who have sustained their lifestyle in a place for dozens and dozens of hundreds of generations without destroying it. Here's two examples. This picture here is a picture of one of my neighbor's cornfields. Here in Central America, they talk about the three sisters, which is essentially, three main crops that people grow: corn and beans and different types of pumpkins or squashes. And so in the traditional cornfield here in El Salvador and Guatemala, it doesn't look nice and neat like this one over here. There's things growing all over the place. By the end of the year, there's vines that are covering the corn crop. Underneath the vines, there's beans that have dried out. Underneath all of that, people let certain wild weeds grow that they eat in soups and things like that. It doesn't look orderly. It might, from the perspective of an agronomist, they might say, "Oh, this is not very productive," and things like that. Because when you look at this is what a cornfield looks like in the United States, for example. It's hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of hectares of one crop grown in straight rows, managed by massive tractors, requiring an enormous amount of pesticides and things like that. But when you look at at the true production or the production statistics, the amount of corn and beans and medicinal crops and green leaves that are edible and pumpkins and other crops compared to one crop that is extremely vulnerable to attacks by pests because it's all grown there. Obviously, this system is more regenerative in that it supports the soil. Obviously, it is much more productive if you take into account all of the different things you can get from it. Obviously, it is much safer for the people who are growing it. You don't need to use massive amounts of chemicals to grow this type of system here, whereas this system you absolutely do. So if we look at these two different types of production systems, the three sisters, or the milpa is what we call it here, the three sisters way of growing corn has been developed over hundreds and thousands of years by Mayan farmers. They have been growing this type of corn, on the slopes of mountains for dozens of generations, and they're still doing it. Whereas this type of farming has lasted for about 60, 70 years and might only last for another half a century. So I guess we have to talk about, where should we learn from? Where should we put our hope? Where should we put our trust? And I would say that the type of wisdom that is found in indigenous and native agricultural systems, and this is just one example. One of the things that's unique about native agricultural practices is that it's different in place to place. In Africa, they're going to be growing different crops. In Asia, they're going to be doing different crops. But each of these indigenous groups are going to have their own ways, their own strategies, their own techniques, their own cultural norms that allow a system of agriculture to be abundant without destroying the resource base upon which it lasts, which it requires. Real quick, to finish up, I just have a few more slides. I want to talk real quick about two other systems of production. One is called agroecology and one is called permaculture. I would say that both of these have kind of piggybacked or learned from, indigenous agricultural systems. But agroecology is one that's relatively new. And I have a really short video, two short videos I want to show you. Let me know if you can hear them. This one's on agroecology.
In the 1950s and 60s, the world saw an explosion of new farming technologies. This green revolution increased crop yields and promised us prosperity, but it also polluted soils and water, marginalized small-scale farmers, and erased traditional crops and diets. As agricultural landscapes have become more and more uniform, wildlife habitats have been lost, creating the perfect conditions for dangerous diseases to spill over into human populations. So what now? Do we double down on intensive farming? More techno fixes to outrun pests and control our environment? Actually, the future of farming could be very different. Across the world, communities are converging around a simple but powerful concept: agroecology. Agroecology is a way of farming with nature, not against it. It builds resilience to climate change and disease outbreaks by combining different plants and animals based on farmers' knowledge of their local environments. Agroecology doesn't rely on chemicals to fertilize crops and fight pests. It relies on diversity, and diversity in the field means fresh and nutritious foods for communities. It provides secure livelihoods based on cooperation, solidarity, and short supply chains that retain value in the community. Agroecology is a different way of organizing food systems based on different principles. So do we stay trapped in the 20th century, or can we embrace agroecology as the next evolution in food systems?
That's just a real short introduction. Agroecology has an enormous amount of studies, but again, it focuses on, I would say, maybe three separate things. One, diversity. Again, we need to grow more than one crop in a field. That's one of the things, and most small farmers around the world do that. And so agroecology, there's all these different techniques and strategies for how to increase diversity so that we can protect soil fertility and rely less and less on these dangerous agrochemical inputs, which have come to dominate agriculture. Secondly, I would say that agroecology also has a unique focus on commercialization. They mentioned in the short video, short supply chains. And that's something I think that is an extremely kind of sustainable and regenerative solution. Small farmers producing diversified foods in a healthy and regenerative way should be able to sell their crops locally. And that means, here in El Salvador, the vast majority of people in the city purchase their foods from supermarkets. And the largest supermarket here is Walmart. Even though it's a U.S. corporation, they've kind of taken over the supermarket chains here in El Salvador. And they bring in foods from all over the world. You can find foods that have probably been grown in Brazil and then shipped to Thailand for packaging and then shipped across the world, the United States, and then shipped again back down to El Salvador. That massive kind of long and complicated supply chains is not inherently sustainable. And I would say that agroecology focuses on how can we reconstruct these local supply chains so that healthy and diversified farming techniques can find local markets for their produce. And then the last one, there's also a focus, I guess I would say, on farmers' rights. They talk a lot about the autonomy of small-scale peasants to decide what they want to grow. Talking a lot about access to land. That's another huge issue. A lot of times young people, especially here in the community where I live, don't get into farming just because land has become so expensive. It's become a commodity and not a resource for growing healthy food. The principles of agroecology include several different things, such as the conservation of natural and agricultural resources, such as water, capital, energy, soil, genetic varieties, the use of renewable resources, again, relying less on fossil fuels, minimizing the use of toxic products, proper management of biodiversity, long-term profit maximization, and the direct connection between farmers. Agroecology implies a holistic approach, focused not just on production, but also on the sustainability of the productive system. The farm itself should be seen as an ecosystem. And when a farm is well designed, when it's well taken care of, a farm can be a regenerative part of the landscape. When we think about these massive farms that look more like deserts, that's obviously not a regenerative part of the landscape. But a small scale farm can provide habitat for wildlife, can while at the same time producing yields, right? And then real quick, we could talk about agroecology and permaculture all day long. There's an enormous body of knowledge about these two farming systems. But again, real quick, another 1-minute video on what is permaculture is perhaps a little bit newer term. It was something that was developed in Australia, maybe back in the 80s, I think it was. But since it has kind of taken off and it's kind of the new I would say kind of keyword. A lot of people, especially here in Central America, talk about permaculture as an opportunity to create agricultural systems, but also cultural systems that are focused on the type of sustainability that we talked about with native peoples.
Permaculture, coined by co-founder Bill Mollison, is a combination of the words permanent and agriculture. permaculture is an ethically based design system for human habitation that's in harmony with the natural world. As Mollison put it, it's the harmonious integration of landscape and people, providing for their food, energy, shelter, and other material and non-material needs in a sustainable way. Of course, you can't have a permanent agriculture without a culture to support it. And so permaculture is also permanent culture. So let's talk about the word permanent for a minute. Permanent means something stable and enduring. When something is permanent, it can continue indefinitely without change. So when we're talking about our food, water, energy, and shelter, we're talking about systems and structures that are designed to last and not degrade. Permanent agriculture is sustainable. It has the ability to sustain indefinitely. And if food, water, energy, and shelter systems are to sustain, then they also need to create more energy than they took to make, to regenerate. And that is the type of designs and structures we create with permaculture. Those that are regenerative of soils, clean water, healthy food, building materials, and natural biodiversity.
So again, I hope that you can see that obviously permaculture, like agroecology, is much more in depth. But the basic idea behind agroecology or permaculture or native agricultural systems is the idea of finding ways to create farms that can subsist permanently. I would say that the number one kind of like indicator that we could look at is, after growing food for however many years, is the soil healthier than it was when you first got there? Is the water quality better than you first got there? Are there more trees and more wildlife? All of these things are possible. And so again, permaculture has a focus on permanence. And one of the, I would say, unique aspects about permaculture is that it focuses a lot on the powers of observation of the natural world. Um, Unfortunately, the agro industry has kind of divorced agriculture from the natural world, to the point that now we want to take farming completely away from the soil, from the fields, and put it into laboratories. But no, permaculture is the best example of farming is what we can see in the natural world. And we need to learn the principles that we can see from the natural world and try to invoke them and try to replicate them on our farms in a way that, natural ecosystems regenerate. They maintain homeostasis. They maintain ecological equilibrium. They allow, species to develop. They allow soil to accumulate and become richer and richer. We can do that on our farms as well. We can do that in our cultures as well if we learn the powers of observation. So real quick, permaculture is famous because it has its three values, its three foundational ethics, which are very simple: earth care, caring for the earth, caring for people, and sharing fairly. And then it has 12 different principles, which we can talk again all about, but some of the principles, I'll just read a few that I think are important. The importance of observing, the importance of catching and storing energy, of using and valuing renewable resources. Number 6, producing no waste in a proper system. If you look at like a forest ecosystem, there is nothing that is wasted. The source of waste from one organism is a source of food for another one. And we can develop farms that do the same thing, that do not produce waste, that we can always recycle things back into the system to create more regenerative and more sustainable soils and farmings. Use small scale solutions, value diversity, and creatively use and respond to change. These are just some of the principles that are foundational for permaculture. In conclusion, it's about 8:45. It's about 45 minutes since I started. I want to leave a time, like I said, for questions and answers and comments. But real quick, the introduction to this class that Dr. Valson mentioned was about community development. And I hope that you all have made the connection there. I do believe that for those people who work in community development, who want to work in community development, valuing the traditional systems that still exist, especially in rural communities, should be one of the most important things that we do. Instead of trying to implement outside methods, especially those that are based on agro-industry, it is important to be humble and search for, the innate, inherent sources of wisdom in these communities that have developed their own agricultural systems, their own native solutions for how to provide food and shelter and fiber and fuel and all the other things that we need to survive from a landscape in a way that doesn't degrade that. Industrial agriculture and the globalized food system in general have us on the precipice of a true ecological and social disaster. That was the first part of the presentation. Secondly, it's necessary to start to combat some of the myths about efficiency and productivity so that we can see the achievements and the wisdom and the knowledge that's inherent in all of these small scale peasant agricultural systems around the world. And lastly, I would say indigenous peoples and their ancestral wisdom and how that relates to other systems such as agroecology and permaculture must be our guide for the construction of a truly sustainable alternative to guarantee healthy and productive agriculture for future generations. So I will leave it there. We've got about 15 minutes or so. If anybody has a comment, you can raise your hand, or I'll let Dr. Valson intermediate there. If anybody wants to share an experience, I'm also more than happy to hear that. So the floor is yours.
That was really a top-notch, magnificent presentation, Tobias Roberts. You've been really impressive, and I am sure all the participants would agree with me that your presentation was truly amazing. We've had a huge amount of ideas and hints and clues and techniques about how the world is moving with food production, and we're talking about a topic that is essential for just our survival, as we all need to eat. And I don't want to go into all the details that you have presented, Tobias, because I am really satisfied. So let's quickly give a chance to our attendees to ask questions, beginning with Dominic. Dominic Forbes, the first question will be with you.
Yes, good morning. As you communicated, Dr. Valson, you are completely satisfied with the presentation, as am I. Therefore, my question to Mr. Tobias Roberts is, how can we keep in touch? Thank you.
It's a good one.
Yeah, I will gladly share my email here in the chat. I'm also sharing the presentation. But yeah, I'm always happy to collaborate in any way that I can. So I'll share my email here. That's probably the best way. So if anyone wants to be in touch with me, you can do it that way.
In the world of teaching, that is really super impressive. I love that, Tobias. What do you think, Abdul Fattah? Your turn is now. Abdul Fattah. Abdul Fattah has raised hands, but it looks like that participant is not quite ready, or the microphone is still off, as I'm trying on my end to turn that microphone on, but Abdul Fattah is still far away. There we go, Abdul Fattah, go ahead. No, Abdul Fattah is still far away, off. So let's go to Professor Festus. Professor Festus, I just noticed Professor Festus was raising hands, and now we've lost him also. So what about, hold on, give me a second. Professor Festus, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thanks so much. Thanks to you and to the presenter of the course. Quick question. In the nearest future, the AI, artificial intelligence, seems to be taking the center stage of all professions and endeavor. What would be the place of AI in all of this? That is the question I want to ask the presenter.
Yeah, artificial intelligence and farming. That's
Yes.
that's an interesting one. I still haven't quite. I mean, it's still very new. I would say on my own personal level, I am suspicious of these types of technologies. But I will say that I guess there's two different, I guess, modes of thought. One is that, yeah, we're gonna lose control of artificial intelligence, and who knows what it'll do in the future. But then there's also a biologist that a guy who came up with a thing called the Gaia hypothesis. His name is escaping right now, but he was a biologist who talked a lot about the need to protect the earth. And his last book, he actually just died recently. He wrote his last book when he was 100 years old, and he said that our hope should be to rely on artificial intelligence to get us out of some of the problems that we have. And the idea is that humanity is not good at, I guess you should say, responding to the ecological problems we've created, and that artificial intelligence systems, might be able to come up with all of these different solutions that we can have. I'm not an expert in AI. I would say that there's probably some applications for how that can happen, but I would also argue that artificial intelligence, they gain their knowledge base from access to everything that's on the internet. And unfortunately, a lot of the indigenous and native agricultural systems, all of that knowledge that doesn't come from the internet. It's not somebody who wants to sit down and figure out how can I plant corn? What can I, they're going to Google what is the most organically friendly way to grow a corn crop. No, indigenous and native agricultural traditions and the wisdom behind that stem from hundreds and thousands of years of inhabiting a place, a territory. And I don't know if AI systems are going to be able to have access to that knowledge to share that. So I would say that while there might be some applications for AI in certain situations, it makes more sense for us to look towards indigenous people, native people, and be humble enough to learn from them.
Thank you very much, Professor Tobias Roberts. Bill, I don't know if that's a real name, but we are on your end at this time, Bill.
Yes, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's good morning for me.
Okay, it's afternoon in Ghana here, and It's great to be part of this class. And I'm so excited because it has been hammered that we look at natural ways of growing our crops, what is native to us. And I always have this problem of people importing toxic substances just in the name of making their crops have greater yields. And in Ghana here, we are really suffering from kidney and liver diseases. And sometimes you can trace it to pesticides, weedicides, and inorganic substances for manure. And so I'm very happy that the presenter is insisting on looking at the native ways, the old ways of farming. And I would want to say that wherever we find ourselves, we should encourage people to at least plant something. If it is pepper that you can have in your backyard, you and then eventually you would want to experiment with other seeds. So I just want to commend you for organizing this seminar and to say that we receive it in great faith. And if there's any opportunity, when we have any challenge like a sick soil, what can be done? If there's any opportunity to still get back and get recommendations so that those of us who have decided to go organic and to plant what we eat will be able to get the help, I think.
Okay, we have lost Bell. That's a very interesting comment from Ghana. I don't know if you want to have a counter comment, Tobias.
No, I just I appreciate that. I think you're right. Again, I would say that the future should lie in learning again from all these systems that unfortunately, at least here in El Salvador, a lot of people have lost that knowledge, right? But fortunately, there are still, and I think that's kind of the indigenous wisdom of, again, looking to elders, learning from people who have still maintained access to this traditional knowledge base. And I hope that we can continue to look towards, elders in our community and people who still have access to that types of knowledge.
Thank you very much. Still very interesting comments and ideas about today's topic, the food industry, as we all have to get involved somehow, because definitely we need to eat. I'm hungry right now, and I'm heading to the kitchen now to get some food. We need food. So let's go to Ivy Suswole. Your question or comment, Ivy? It looks like Ivy. Are you there, Ivy? Your audio is off. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vasin and Tobias, for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, I have come to realize when we were growing, agriculture was very highly respected, where the indigenous were practicing using the natural materials to grow the crops, and we were eating well, we were living long. But in this generation, so many chemicals are being applied to the foodstuffs, and we eat, we don't live long, we die early. Thank you very much, Tobias, for bringing us back to the ancient days, because those days, our parents, our grandparents, they used to live long because there was no chemicals in the food. But this generation, we are dying early, we are dying young, because we are eating so many chemicals from the restaurant to the ground and whatsoever. It's very, very informative and insightful. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Vasin and Tobias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well, Ivy. Samuel Adebiyi. Samuel Adebiyi, what's your question, please?
Thank you very much, Dr. Vasi and Dr. Tobias. First of all, I want to commend you for this presentation. And then I want to add that the major challenges we still have to answer is, number one, how do we ensure improved productivity from the smallholders? The smallholders' output per unit of resource is still very low. And then we have fast-growing population in the developing countries, so we have food shortage and food supply gaps. So the smallholders, to be able to fit into what you are saying, would need to increase their productivity. That's question number one. Do you have ideas to share on improvement in productivity? And then number two, we just had towards the end something on permaculture. How do we ensure continuity and sustainability if the existing farmers are aging and the younger ones are not coming in? What do you have to share with us as your own ideas, how we draw younger people into smallholder farming and therefore ensure we still stick to the natural as opposed to the chemically induced foods that we are eating now? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Samuel. I think those are certainly two challenges that we face. Regarding productivity, I would say that, again, small scale farmers can be more productive, especially when you take into account all of the different sources of production, all of the kind of hidden sources of production that a lot of times aren't seen. But I also agree that in many parts of the world, that knowledge base has been lost. These systems that have been developed for thousands of years are unfortunately being replaced. So how do people become more productive, especially when young farmers, haven't had that opportunity to learn from their elders and from the systems that were in place. That's where I would say agroecology and permaculture come in. I think there is certainly a role for nonprofit organizations and things like that to come in and share some of this knowledge. How can we use the combination of traditional sources of knowledge, traditional growing techniques, but then also, the scientific basis of permaculture and agroecology. Agroecology especially focuses a lot on, for example, how you can increase fertility in soils through cultivating microorganisms, inoculating soils with healthy organisms so that I can reproduce more. We should also recognize and admit that, the landscapes that people inhabit now have been affected by agro-industry. There is larger populations. There are new challenges that need to be faced. And there is certainly a role for scientific investigation. It's not necessarily about going back just to primitive methods. It's about relying on the wisdom inherent in those methods, but also combining those with scientific investigation, with innovation, with different ways to improve production. So that's the first one I would say. And then secondly, how to get young people interested in farming. That is a big one. That is a huge challenge. And here where I live, migration to the United States is a huge issue. And young people know that they can make more money migrating to the United States than farming. And a lot of people choose to do that. The only thing that I can say is that I think that sooner or later, people are going to have to come back to the land, because this tendency to continue to reduce the percentage of people who are farming is not sustainable. And then I guess on a more practical level, I think that making farming interesting, it doesn't have to be about, I would say that, growing a monoculture of corn or soybeans where you sit in a tractor all day and do that, that's boring. There's not any intellectual work to it. Helping young people to see that it can be interesting to grow diversified crops, to try out new crops, and also to create these local markets, these short supply chains where perhaps they can make a little bit more money through marketing directly to consumers, come up with innovative ways, add value to their products. For example, if you have a couple heads of dairy cattle, instead of just selling the milk wholesale to some intermediate, teach young people about how to make yogurt, how to make cheeses, how to market those products themselves. Those things are interesting. The idea of turning small scale farming into a marketable business opportunity, obviously creates more money, but it's also more fun. For example, with all of the vegetables that we grow here, we create value-added products. We make different types of fermented vegetables that we market directly to consumers. Those are things that are fun, offer a little bit more economic incentive, and make farming more interesting for young people. And I think that that's maybe a solution I think that we need to explore.
Professor Tobias, we have several hands up. I don't know if you want me to allow those questions to be asked. We have run out of time, but it's up to you.
No, I don't mind. Yeah, it's interesting conversation. So
wonderful. So let's go now to Frederick Shadrack. Frederick, with Professor Tobias' permission, go ahead, ask your question, please. Frederick. No, Frederick is not ready. So we're gonna move to Abdul Rahman. Abdul Rahman. Oh, give me a second, Abdul. Frederick is now ready. Go ahead, Frederick. No, I was wrong. Abdul.
Mute. Hello, good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
Yes, I want to first of all thank you, Dr. Valkin, for organizing this webinar, and also Dr. Tobias for his wonderful presentation. And I actually agree with him that we have to go natural. And like in Sierra Leone, for example, hello?
Go ahead.
Can I continue?
We're listening.
Okay. Like in Sierra Leone, we have 5 agroecological zones. We have 1 upland and 4 lowlands. But I want to go to one of the lowlands, which are very attractive to farmers. That's the inland valley swamps, the IVS. That's where most of our smaller farmers work for their subsistence. But my issue here that is about ecological farming and permaculture. Like in the inland valley swamps, we have the valley bottom, that is the hydromorphic zone, which comprises of the fluxial and the phreatic zones. Then we have the pluvial zones and the valleys, the top of the valleys and the dry areas. And normally here, what we do is in the valley bottom, like in the rainy season, we do rice farming. And in the lower slopes, we do pineapples and oranges and that sort of things. And the middle slopes, we do the oil palm, etc. And the top of the slopes, we do these fast-growing trees. So I just want to know whether this is part of the permaculture. That's actually what I want to know, is whether it's part of permaculture or it's a different approach altogether. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I agree. Permaculture actually has one of the things it talks about is about zones. So on any small scale holding, there are going to be certain parts of the landscape that are better for certain things, like you just mentioned. Up at the top of the mountains, obviously you want to create tree cover so you can maintain springs and water and all that. And so yeah, permaculture is certainly about finding, identifying your zones, identifying what crops grow best there. And so yeah, there's this whole thing. Permaculture talks about 5 different zones on a scale. Zone 1 is what's closest to your home, which you use on a daily basis, and it goes through zones 1, 2, 3, 4, and zone 5 is always kind of like an area that you leave undisturbed, so that you can continue to observe the natural world and learn what nature would do in that space if you were not doing anything. So yeah, I mean, I would encourage you to look at permaculture's idea of zones, but it's very similar to what you're mentioning about determining what is the best use for a landscape based on your observation of the natural world.
Frederick, are you now ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Really
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, welcome. Thank you, Professor. Good evening, everybody from Malawi. What I wanted to ask or to comment on, I think I heard from Professor Tobias when he talked about the 4 advantages of the micro farming, particularly small scale farming, using small scale farms, that they would actually 2.5 times production. Now we have a situation where people are promoting mega farming, where they would want actually large scale farms. I would want to ask him, has he got any ideas that he can add to maybe to boost or to encourage the small scale production, which has been taken offside as of now? People seem like neglecting it somehow, and the small scale farmers are neglected. They say they're expensive or whatever, but he has brought in very good suggestions where production is going to increase for you small scale farmers. And has he got any other additional information that he can give so that we can encourage and motivate this farming so that we encourage production? Because the song, like in this part of the world, like in Malawi, for example, we always sing about, oh no, small scale farmers are expensive, small scale farmers, no, we cannot concentrate on this, we need to go to the large scale. So and then commercialization cannot take place in the small scale farming. But he has brought in a lot of knowledge and a lot of deep emphasis on the same. So I wanted to find out whether he has additional information on this. Thank you.
Yeah, Frederick, I would say there's different challenges in every part of the world for small scale farming. But unfortunately, I think in most parts of the world, access to land and resources is an issue that comes up. That's a political issue, right? What type of land reform can every country do or implement so that small scale farmers have access to enough land? Because if you have, just 1 acre or half an acre, it's hard to be productive. There is an optimal scale for production, of course. I would say once you get over 100 acres of land, maybe production starts to dip because it's so large and you can only grow one thing. But yeah, how could governments around the world implement policies and laws and things like that aimed at making land, arable farming land accessible to young people and to farmers who want to farm in a good way. There's also cultural barriers, like we talked about. How can young people become interested in farming? There's also economic barriers. How can we recreate these local markets, these local marketing opportunities, these local supply chains that used to dominate the world but have been replaced? There's no shortage of challenges on the table. But like I said, I think that each place has their own challenges. But I would say that there's definitely, political implications, there's economic implications, there's cultural implications, and all of those have to go hand in hand in order to start to restore, any sort of local agrarian economy upon which we must depend in the future.
I know Dr. Swanda Ramadwa, you've been waiting for a while, so I want to give you this opportunity at this time to make your voice heard.
Thank you so much, Professor Valisin. And Tobias, you are a star. I just want to comment, it's not actually a question. I want to say, let's go back to basics. The changing world have destroyed, I might say, a black man's life. We used to have a small agricultural farming in our home, having chickens, exactly the same Tobias highlighted. And then we grow up without even asthma, without even arthritis. And then the Western world come in. Then the whole train lose its focus. So I want to say now the challenge is to go back to the basics. We are also experiencing the same thing in South Africa. There are the farmers called Afrikaner who has been supplying us with food. And now because of political challenges, we are battling even some basic food as well. As you know, in Zimbabwe, they chase a lot of farmers. Then they went to Zambia. Zambia has got more food than Zimbabwe. So if you hit the farmer, you are hitting the whole lifelong life. And the reality is that without food, we'll never get anywhere. And the issue of the young people is because we're not educating them enough about food security and agriculture as well. If we start from there, they are not even aware. They just think food is very expensive right now because it's being manipulated. I mean, we are already in the laboratory. You said food growth in the laboratory. We've already reached that stage where if you check, we have got a shop called Woolworth. They sell organic food. And then they sell some, you can even taste the eggs. They are not the same. So meaning the indigenous agricultural farming is the best way to go. But how? It's very difficult because what happened, mass production to feed many people than to go to check if they've got healthy or not. So also the value chain. If you start a small farming, you want to enter into the market, it's very difficult as well because they will end up saying, no, you're going to produce too few things. We need a large scale commercial. I wanted just to comment to say, well done. And it's a very, very, very important presentation, this one. And thank you for AIU for making this possible. And Robert, you must come back. Thank you so much, Dr. Valisin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Swanda. You've heard the complaint in quotes, Professor Tobias, that you've got to come back, not only once or twice, several times, maybe 20, 40, because the topic is really fundamental. I don't want to make comments because I see hands all over. The chat line has been flooded out with questions and comments. I haven't seen a class with that level of success, Professor Tobias. But please allow me to have two more questions. We're gonna go to Richie Adewuzi, and then the last question would be from Abdul Fattah Almayer. So Richie Adewuzi, before the last question. Adewuzi.
Thank you so much.
Adewuzi.
I'm unmuting and it's going back to mute. I don't know. I'm also on mute. I'm also putting myself back on video. It's going back. I don't know what's happening. And yes, thank you so much, Professor, and thank you, Doctor. The professor has actually taken some shots at part of my question. Agriculture is a beautiful thing. No matter how package it, non-names, new names, old names, food production, food security, they're all good things. Now, part of my issue is this. You do not, for any system to work, it depends on human beings. Even computers, human beings will still need to program, will still need to operate computers for them to do whatever, even AI, whatever, humans have handled it. Now, someone had already asked this and the professor touched on it, about getting young people, especially young graduates, okay, interested in agriculture. Where I come from in Nigeria originally, several years ago, I introduced a project to encourage young graduates to become, because the state I come from in Nigeria is agrarian. We're farmers, hunters originally and all of that. But everybody has gone to white collar jobs and all of that. And that's a problem. And the professor answered it in part by talking about migration to the US and all of that. What exactly, because it doesn't make too much, it's not too helpful to be talking about systems that work without talking about the manpower that would, power that system. It's a problem. I'm talking about something I have worked at for the past, 20 years, really, getting young people. I'm involved in civil society, nonprofit and all of that, okay? Getting young people involved in agriculture. Professor, you touched on it. What exactly can be done? Yes, we can say NGOs should get involved and all of that. How, please?
Yeah, that's, like I said, that's a challenge, and I don't know if there's a surefire answer to that, but let me just say one thing. One of the problems I would say is that there tends to have, because you mentioned, how do we get young people who have studied, people who have graduated? And a lot of times there's this idea that if here, especially in El Salvador where I live, if a young person goes to school, if they go to university, the idea is that they do that so that they can move away from the land. In that sense, a lot of times education is a way that extracts young people from the land.
Yes.
I have a bachelor's degree in history and 2 master's degrees, and I decided to move back to the land. And one of the things that is fascinating to me is a lot of times people have this idea that doing physical farm labor is not, it kind of takes you away from the intellectual idea that you can't have the both. And I would say that the exact opposite is true in my own experience, that the more that you interact with the land, the more that you farm, it's hard work, it's good, hard physical labor, but it's also mental work. Every day you have to use your mind and and think about how I can introduce new systems, how can I produce in a way that that is respectful of nature, that restores ecological balance, that regenerates the soil. What can I do to create an economic incentive for myself and for the small crop that we work with? There's an enormous amount of challenges that require intellectual and academic work. And I think we have to challenge this idea that farmers can only be illiterate and uneducated people. No, that one, small farmers have an enormous amount of traditional knowledge that we need to learn from, but that also that young people can use their education, their knowledge that they've learned from educational systems, and apply that to respond to some of these challenges that we have related to farming. And I would say that's an issue. Young people need to understand that education does not need to take them away from the land. Education should be an opportunity to return to the land and use that education to strengthen traditional agricultural systems. And I think that unfortunately that's not been the case. It's been the opposite. And yeah, try and reconcile those two is something that we need to do.
Very true, Professor. Very true. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.
So as announced, the last question, ladies and gentlemen, we're sorry for those others who raise hands and we have a time frame. We've got to respect that. We've been out of time for quite a while. It is just with the permission of Professor Tobias Roberts that we have allowed some more questions. The last one will be from Abdul Fattah Al-Marabai. Abdul Fattah, go ahead. Abdul Fattah, all right.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
All right, that's good. What amazing presentation today. And thank you for all who organized this presentation. And it's very important, you know, one of the important issue, you know, in our world. So what I would like to ask today in this about this topic, it's about the region, the different of region. You know, as you know, I'm from South Libya, and it's a big desert, you know. So is there any possibility to implement this type of system in my country? As you know, that the big problem is providing a source of water. And thank you.
Yeah, no, I would say that obviously there's different ecosystems and different challenges in different parts of the world, and deserts, and there's increasing desertification around the world. There's a lack of water. These are challenges that are going to get more and more severe with climate change, with biodiversity loss. I don't know your specific region, but several years ago, I went to the desert in South and Southwest parts of the United States, and there were still indigenous Navajo communities who were, growing corn in areas that had extremely low amounts of rainfall. And they had all these traditional ways of protecting water, maintaining humidity in the soil, using rock mulches, moving water through different canals. Again, I would say indigenous farming systems, people have lived in every different climate, from the northern Arctic to the hottest deserts in the world. And people did that, before there were, supermarket chains and things like that. So, our ancestors were incredibly smart and innovative about how to provide for their needs in extreme climates and regions. And so I would say we need to learn from that. But then again, permaculture and agroecology and all these other ideas, they have techniques about how can you harvest water in areas that have extremely low rainfalls. And there's always solutions out there. I'm not an expert on farming in the desert, but there's issues about how you can capture the humidity in the air, how you can protect humidity in the soil, how you can grow crops that require that do well in arid and dry regions. And so, yeah, again, it's about learning from the experience of the past, but then also adapting, some of the new some of the new scientific investigations through permaculture, agroecology, and others, right? It's not easy, but I think that, actually being on the land and experimenting and learning is the best way to find solutions to these issues, yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Tobias Roberts. It's been an enormous amount of energy that you have spent to make yourself available to us for this really top-notch, world-class presentation, the best that I've ever seen so far, as I just indicated. We are all grateful to you, Professor Roberts, and we do anticipate you will agree, like you just said, and so many of our participants have also requested it, to come back for more ideas, more hints, more techniques, more knowledge about this field of food production, community development. The last word with you, Professor Roberts.
No, just thank you for everyone. Again, I appreciate the questions. I appreciate the debate. I hear that this is an issue that's important to lots of people, and that makes me excited. There are no easy solutions, there are no easy answers, but the more people who are involved and who are concerned, I think we can take back our the supply of our food that's been captured by the agro industry and return to more sustainable systems. So thank you all, and I appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, everyone, everybody.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Doctor. This was a wonderful session. Wonderful.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. Thank you.